Mia crouched beside the dirty dumpster, her small hands shaking as she searched through the cold, crinkling trash bags. The air smelled like old food and wet cardboard, but Mia's stomach growled loudly, ignoring the awful smell. It had been 2 days since she had eaten anything good, just some leftover crusts from a fast food restaurant's garbage bin, barely enough to fill her. She felt desperate, her hunger pushing her to dig deeper, hoping to find something, anything, that could satisfy her empty stomach. The city was covered in shadows as evening fell, casting strange shapes on the alley walls. A nearby streetlight buzzed and flickered, casting a dim light on the cracked pavement and rusted metal containers around her. "Hi there. I'm Goldie, and welcome to Goldie's Love Stories." She tugged at a stubborn knotted plastic bag, feeling its contents shift under her fingers. The bag finally gave way, spilling out a pile of half-eaten food cartons, crumpled receipts, and something that glinted, catching the light. Mia's heart skipped as she reached for it, her fingers brushing the smooth, cold surface. Pulling the item free, she held it up to the flickering streetlight, hardly believing her eyes. It was a watch, a heavy one, with a sleek gold band and a shiny black face that gleamed like polished obsidian. She turned it over in her hands, marveling at the perfect way the metal links caught the light. On the back, an engraving read, "To Mark with all my love forever." The letters were small, faintly worn, but still readable. Mia didn't know much about watches, but she knew enough to recognize this was no cheap knockoff. The realization sank in, and her heart pounded faster. Here in her hands, she held something valuable, something that could mean real money, maybe even a meal, a place to sleep, or clothes without holes. All she had to do was find a pawn shop willing to take it. Her fingers tightened around the watch, feeling its weight and warmth from her skin. But as she clutched it, a second feeling crept in, one she hadn't expected: doubt. Mia glanced around the alley, feeling as though the eyes of 1,000 silent witnesses watched her. What if someone had been looking for this watch, desperate to get it back? Its engraving hinted at a memory, a story, something personal. She wondered if the person it belonged to felt as attached to it as she had to the frayed, brown teddy bear she'd left behind at home. She could still picture her father in that moment, the last time he had exploded in one of his drunken rages, tearing the bear from her hands and throwing it into the corner of their cramped living room. It had been the only gift she had ever received from her grandmother, a small token of love in an otherwise loveless home. The memory cut deep. The last time she had seen her teddy bear, her father's face twisted in rage. "You're too old for that crap, Mia," he had yelled, his voice sharp enough to slice through her spirit. It was just a stuffed toy, but it had been her comfort, a silent witness to her fears and dreams. That night, after her father's outburst, Mia lay in her small, cluttered room. The walls felt like they were closing in on her, suffocating her with memories of shouting and pain. She could hear her parents arguing again, their voices rising and falling like angry waves. Most nights were like this, filled with the chaos of her father's drunken rants and her mother's cries. The alcohol had turned her father into a monster, and Mia felt the fear tightening around her heart. He would stumble through the door late at night, the smell of beer heavy on his breath. It always started with yelling, shouting about money, about life, about how everything was wrong. Sometimes, he'd take out his anger on Mia, his frustration spilling over in the form of harsh words and painful slaps. "You're worthless," he'd scream, and she would shrink back, her heart racing, feeling like a ghost in her own home. Her mother, lost in her own troubles, was often too absorbed in her wine bottles to notice Mia's pain. Instead of comforting Mia, she would sit quietly, tears streaming down her face, drowning her sorrow in drink. Mia felt like she was trapped in a storm, with no way to escape the fury of her father or the sadness of her mother. As she lay in her bed, listening to the arguments echo through the thin walls, a wave of despair washed over her. She wished for a way out, a way to escape the chaos that had become her life. Every day felt like a battle, and she was tired of losing. The thought of staying for one more day was unbearable. The next morning, when the sun peeked through the curtains, Mia made her decision. She packed a small backpack with a change of clothes, a half-eaten chocolate bar she had saved for a tough day, and her notebook filled with drawings and dreams. Her heart raced as she prepared to leave her home, a place that felt more like a prison than a sanctuary. With a final glance at her room, where the peeling paint and faded posters told stories of happier times, she slipped out, careful not to wake her parents. The world outside felt big and frightening, but it also held the promise of freedom. She was determined to take control of her life, to find a place where she could feel safe and loved. In the days that followed, Mia blended into the city, moving quietly among the crowds. She learned to find food and safe places to rest, always keeping her head down and avoiding trouble. Sometimes she felt hopeless, but small acts of kindness gave her hope, a warm piece of bread from a stranger, or a cool drink on a hot day. Each act of kindness reminded her that not everyone was like her parents. But the nights were the hardest. Curling up in dark corners, she shivered in the cold, the memory of her home clinging to her like a shadow. She missed the safety of a real home, even if it had never truly felt safe. In those lonely moments, she wondered if running away had been brave or foolish. Yet, as she sat there, the chill seeping into her bones, she reminded herself that thoughts of her old life couldn't keep her warm or fill her empty stomach. The harsh reality of her situation pressed down on her, sharper than the winter air. Survival was her only priority now, and the watch in her pocket pulsed with the promise of hope, a chance to change everything. Mia glanced down at the watch, its surface gleaming even in the dim light. She could almost hear it whispering possibilities: a warm meal, a safe place to sleep, perhaps even a future where she didn't have to fight for every scrap of food. But that voice was quickly drowned out by a swirl of doubts. This watch wasn't her problem. It was a lifeline, a chance she couldn't afford to let slip through her fingers. The thought of returning it to someone felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. She swallowed hard, pushing down the guilt that gnawed at her. As she tucked the watch deeper into her pocket, she steeled herself against the rising tide of sentimentality. She'd learned early on that survival didn't leave room for emotions, it demanded focus and determination. There would be time for regrets later, but for now, she had to keep moving forward, no matter what it took. There were pawn shops around the city, places with flickering neon signs and bars on the windows, places that didn't ask questions. Her fingers closed around the watch in her pocket as she walked briskly down the street, the cold evening air biting at her cheeks and hands. The first shop she found had metal grates on the windows and smelled like dust and cigarette smoke when she entered. A man with a wrinkled face and a bored expression stood behind the counter, barely glancing up as she approached. She pulled the watch from her pocket, her fingers reluctant to let go of it as she placed it on the counter. The man looked at it, raising an eyebrow. "Where'd a kid like you get something like this?" Mia shrugged, crossing her arms over her chest, her heart thumping. She tried to keep her voice steady. "Does it matter?" He let out a long breath, then picked up the watch, inspecting it carefully, turning it over in his hands. His expression changed subtly, a flicker of interest. But as he glanced back at her, that interest dimmed. "I'll give you $50. 50. The disbelief slipped out before she could stop it. $50 couldn't buy her a safe place to sleep for more than a couple of nights, and the watch felt worth so much more. The man shrugged, already losing interest, his eyes shifting to a magazine behind the counter. "Take it or leave it, kid. Ain't no one paying top dollar without papers for something like this." Frustration tightened Mia's throat, and she grabbed the watch, shoving it back into her pocket. She left without another word, her footsteps echoing on the damp pavement. The next shop wasn't any better. Nor was the third. Each time, she faced the same questions, the same skeptical glances, the same paltry offers. Her desperation grew with each refusal, her frustration churning inside her like a storm. She found herself back in the alley where she'd first discovered the watch, the cold seeping into her bones as she sank to the ground, hugging her knees. She wondered if she'd made a mistake, if she should have accepted that $50. Then, as she sat there, staring into the darkening city, she heard voices nearby, a man and a woman talking, their words drifting through the quiet street. They mentioned the watch's brand, describing it exactly, and how it was the only possession that meant anything to its owner, a rich executive who'd lost it and was apparently heartbroken over it. Mia listened, her heart racing. The man's words echoed in her mind, the only possession that meant anything. She looked down at the watch in her hand, feeling its weight differently now. A part of her bristled, reminding herself she owed nothing to this man. But then another part, a quieter part, spoke up. Maybe, just maybe, returning it could mean more than a quick buck. And maybe for once, she wouldn't have to fight so hard, wouldn't have to scavenge in the shadows. The thought of a real meal, maybe even a reward, flickered to life, as faint as the streetlight's glow, but enough to pull her to her feet. With a small, hesitant breath, Mia made her choice. Mia's sneakers slapped against the slick pavement as she made her way through the city, the towering skyscrapers casting her in their long shadows. She clutched the watch tightly in her hand, her fingers wrapped around it as if it were a lifeline. She'd spent hours roaming the business district, hoping to find the man who'd lost it, or someone who might know him. The sky had gone from gray to a deep blue, and the streetlights began to flicker to life, casting an orange glow over the bustling sidewalks. After what felt like forever, Mia's eyes landed on a grand building, all glass and steel, with the logo she'd heard mentioned by the couple back in the alley. The massive sign gleamed over the entrance, proudly displaying the name of the CEO she was looking for. It was his watch, the very one he'd reportedly lost and been heartbroken over. Her stomach twisted with nerves, but she set her jaw. If she could find him, if he was as important as he seemed, there was a chance, maybe even a good chance, that he'd be willing to help her in return. As she reached the revolving doors, a chill ran up her spine. The lobby inside was guarded by a security desk and cameras that scanned every corner. She ducked her head low, glancing around to see if anyone was watching, then quickly slipped in behind a group of well-dressed office workers. She kept her pace brisk, mirroring their confident strides as she moved toward the elevators, her heart pounding with every step. The elevator doors slid open with a quiet whoosh, and Mia squeezed in, her small figure nearly hidden between the tall suits around her. As the numbers climbed, she felt the weight of what she was about to do settle over her. There was no going back now. She took a shaky breath, clutching the watch tighter. When the elevator stopped at the top floor, she stepped out, alone now in a long silent hallway that stretched toward a grand glass door with a plaque beside it. Mark Rutherford, CEO. This was it. Mia tiptoed toward the door, her hands clammy as she reached out and turned the handle. To her surprise, it opened without resistance, and she slipped inside, her eyes widening at the luxury around her. The office was enormous, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city, and polished wood furniture that gleamed under soft, warm lights. And there, at a massive mahogany desk, sat a man, his head bent over a stack of papers. "Excuse me, Mr. Rutherford," she called, her voice wavering slightly. She took a step forward, her gaze locked on the man behind the desk. The man looked up, his brow furrowing as he noticed her. He was older than she expected, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to see right through her. He set his pen down slowly, studying her with a curious, almost guarded expression. "What are you doing here?" His voice was firm but not unkind, a mix of authority and curiosity. "How did you get past security?" Mia swallowed, feeling her pulse quicken. She held up the watch, letting it glint in the office's dim light. I found this. In a dumpster. I think it belongs to you." The CEO's gaze dropped to the watch, his eyes widening in recognition. He rose from his chair, crossing the room in a few long strides until he stood before her, looking from the watch to her face. His hand reached out, hovering over the watch as if he couldn't believe it was real. "I thought I'd never see this again," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. He looked back at her, his eyes softening. "Where did you find it?" "In an alley downtown," Mia replied, lifting her chin. I heard it was important to you, so I came here. I thought maybe you'd help me. I don't have anywhere else to go." He tilted his head, his gaze sharp, as if he could see through her words to the truth behind them. "No place to go?" His voice softened, and he gave a slight nod, as though piecing together an understanding of her life. "You've been surviving on the streets?" She nodded, feeling a strange vulnerability under his piercing gaze. The weight of her situation seemed to settle between them, thickening the silence. She hadn't meant to reveal so much, but the truth had spilled out before she could stop it. After a long pause, he reached out, gently closing his hand over the watch, but he didn't pull it from her grasp. Instead, he looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher, a mix of pity, gratitude, and something else, something warmer. "Mia, was it?" he asked, his voice soft. She nodded. "I could give you a reward," he continued, his voice low and thoughtful. "Money, maybe even enough to keep you off the streets for a while. But that wouldn't change your life, would it?" Mia blinked, the words catching her off guard. She stared at him, unsure of what to say, the hope for money twisting into something more complex. What if, he hesitated, as though carefully considering his words. What if instead of a reward, I offered you a chance, a real chance to change your life? His gaze held hers, intense and unwavering. A place to stay, an education, support. It's not something I offer lightly, but seeing how far you've come, how determined you are, I think you deserve a chance to make something of yourself. Mia's heart raced, her mind spinning with the weight of his offer. A part of her wanted to grab it, to hold on to this lifeline he was extending. But another part held back, reminding her of all the broken promises, the adults who'd lied or turned away when she'd needed them most. Trust didn't come easy, and here she was, face to face with a man who represented everything she had never known: security, warmth, stability. I don't know, her voice faltered, her gaze dropping to the floor. She wanted to believe him, to trust that someone could care without asking for anything in return. But the fear of disappointment held her back. Mark knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level, his expression kind and understanding. Take your time, Mia. You don't have to decide right now. Just know that this offer is real. You deserve a chance to feel safe. Mia looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of deception, but found only sincerity. Her grip loosened on the watch, and for the first time, she felt the faintest flicker of hope. Mia took a deep breath, her heart racing as she nodded slowly. She accepted his offer, ready to leave behind the shadows of her past and embrace a chance at a new life. Hours later, Mia shifted uneasily as the car pulled up to the grand iron-gated estate, a world she could hardly imagine just hours ago. She clutched her thin, frayed backpack, a piece of her old life, as if it could ground her in this surreal moment. She glanced at Mark Rutherford, the CEO who had offered her a life beyond survival, who now seemed calm and determined beside her. The driver opened her door, and Mia slid out, gaping at the sprawling mansion before her. It was nothing like the streets where she had spent countless nights, nothing like the broken-down buildings where she'd hidden herself away. Mark noticed her awe and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. This place, it's yours now too, Mia, he said, his voice gentle yet firm. Come on. Let me show you around. They stepped inside, where warm lights cast a golden glow on polished floors, and art lined the walls. Mia's footsteps echoed softly as they walked through hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. Mark pointed out rooms one by one, a library filled with shelves of books, a quiet sunroom with plants climbing up the windows, a cozy living room with a crackling fire. Mia's head spun. She'd never seen anything so luxurious, so safe. Finally, they stopped at a small room tucked away from the larger halls. Inside was a bed with soft linens, a small desk, and a window overlooking the garden. This is your space, he said. I know it's a lot to take in, but you can make it your own. Mia hesitated, standing in the doorway. She was used to being alert, always on guard, but here, something began to shift inside her. She put her backpack down slowly, almost reverently, on the bed. This room, this house, she wanted to believe they could be hers. Over the days that followed, Mark's kindness didn't fade. He set her up with tutors, who helped her catch up on the schooling she'd missed. The lessons were hard, and sometimes she got frustrated, her mind rebelling against the unfamiliar structure. But every time she felt like giving up, she'd remember Mark's words, his faith in her potential. Slowly, she began to believe she might actually have a future. The tutors were patient, guiding her through each lesson, and soon she found herself absorbed in books she'd never had access to before. History, science, literature, whole worlds opened up, places she could travel to in her mind even as she stayed within the walls of her new home. She discovered an unexpected love for math, finding comfort in the predictable patterns and solid answers. Mia began to see Mark not just as a stranger who had helped her, but as someone she could trust, someone who genuinely cared. He'd ask her each evening how her day had gone, listening with interest to her stories of triumphs and struggles alike. His patience and understanding built a bridge of trust, piece by piece. For the first time, Mia felt as though she had a voice, that someone valued what she had to say. As the months passed, Mia gradually let go of the survival instincts that had ruled her life. She no longer hid scraps of food or slept with her backpack clutched close. She still carried scars, memories of the cold nights, the constant hunger, the cruel faces that had looked down on her. But here, in this warm house, with a bed that was hers alone and a door she could close, she began to feel her old life slipping away. Her growth wasn't just academic. Mark had also arranged for her to join community activities, places where she could meet others her age, to learn how to connect, to play, to laugh freely. It was there that she found friendship, a few kids who, like her, carried hardships but were learning to move forward. They shared stories and laughter, and for the first time, Mia felt a sense of belonging. One afternoon, as she sat in the garden, the sun warming her face, Mia reflected on her journey. She thought of that fateful day when she'd found the watch in the dumpster, a simple object that had seemed like her ticket to a quick fix, but had become the catalyst for something far greater. She realized how much had changed, how far she'd come from the scared girl who'd crept into a building to meet a stranger. She had taken a risk, and it had led her here, safe, supported, and with dreams she hadn't dared to imagine. Mark found her sitting quietly in the garden that evening, her gaze distant. He took a seat beside her, not saying a word. After a few minutes, she turned to him, a small smile on her lips. "Thank you," she said simply, the words heavy with meaning. He looked at her with warmth, his expression softening. "You did this, Mia. You had the courage to reach out, to trust. You deserve this life, this future." They sat together in silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting the garden in shades of pink and gold. The world stretched out before her, vast and full of possibilities, and for the first time, she was ready to face it with open arms. Thanks for watching. How would you rate this story? Give it 1 to 5 hearts in the comments and let me know what you thought. This is a brand new channel, and your support means the world to me. If you enjoyed the story, please consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you never miss an episode. Your likes, comments, and shares help this community grow, and I'd be so grateful to have you along for the journey. See you next time.